A British ship sinks off the coast of Australia. A pregnant woman named Eliza Fraser washes ashore on a remote island inhabited by Indigenous people. Her husband, the ship's captain, dies. She survives for weeks living with the Butchella people before being rescued. When she returns to civilization, she becomes an instant celebrity, telling dramatic stories about her ordeal that captivate audiences across the British Empire. She receives money, fame, and sympathy. There's just one problem. Almost everything she said was a lie. Her fabricated stories about savage natives would be used to justify violence against Indigenous Australians for generations. This is the true story of Eliza Fraser, a woman whose lies changed history, whose testimony was used as propaganda to dispossess an entire people, and whose name is now synonymous with colonial deception. This is about how one person's self-serving lies can echo across centuries, causing harm that persists long after the liar is gone. The year was 1836, and the British Empire was at its height, controlling vast territories across the globe and dominating international trade through its powerful merchant navy. Ships constantly moved between Britain's far-flung colonies, carrying goods, passengers, and the ambitions of an empire that believed it had a divine right to rule the world. One of these vessels was the Stirling Castle, a merchant ship making what should have been a routine voyage from Sydney, Australia, to Singapore, carrying a cargo of timber and general goods. Captain James Fraser commanded the Stirling Castle. He was an experienced seaman who'd spent years navigating the treacherous waters around Australia and Southeast Asia. At 49 years old, he was past his prime, but still capable, still respected in maritime circles, still trusted with valuable ships and cargoes. He'd made this Sydney-Singapore run multiple times before, without serious incident, and he had no reason to expect this voyage would be any different from previous successful trips. Aboard the ship with Captain Fraser was his wife, Eliza. This wasn't unusual for the era. Ship captains often brought their wives on long voyages rather than leaving them at home for months or years at a time. Eliza was in her mid-30s, considerably younger than her husband, and pregnant with what would have been their child. Traveling while pregnant on a wooden sailing ship for weeks across dangerous waters seems reckless by modern standards, but it was accepted practice in the 1830s when options were limited and separation for extended periods was the only alternative. The Stirling Castle departed Sydney in mid-May 1836 with a crew of about 18 men, plus Captain and Eliza Fraser. The voyage began normally, following the established route northward along Australia's eastern coast, before turning west towards Singapore. The weather was reasonable, the ship handled well, and there was no indication of the disaster approaching. The first several days, it was just another merchant voyage, routine and unremarkable. But on May 22nd, disaster struck. The Stirling Castle was navigating through the waters around what's now called the Great Barrier Reef, a massive coral reef system extending for over 2,300 kilometers along Australia's northeastern coast. The reef is one of the world's great natural wonders, but also one of its greatest maritime hazards. Countless ships have been wrecked on those coral formations, which can tear through wooden hulls as easily as knives through cloth. The Stirling Castle struck a reef or submerged rock that tore open her hull. Water poured in faster than the crew could pump it out. Captain Fraser made the critical decision: abandon ship. The crew and passengers took to the ship's boats, small wooden lifeboats that were never intended for long ocean voyages, but were now their only hope for survival. They watched as the Stirling Castle settled lower in the water, and eventually disappeared beneath the waves, taking most of their supplies and all their hopes for a comfortable passage to their destination. The survivors crowded into two small boats, inadequately supplied with food and water for what they hoped would be a short journey to the nearest settlement. They had some provisions salvaged from the ship, but nothing like what they'd need if the journey took more than a few days. They had limited navigational equipment. They had no real plan, except to head for the Australian mainland and hope they'd find help before they died of thirst or starvation. What followed were several weeks of suffering that nobody disputed, that all survivors agreed upon, that represented genuine hardship, regardless of what lies would later be told about subsequent events. The boats drifted north along the coast, making slow progress, unable to land safely because the coastline was rocky and dangerous. The sun beat down mercilessly. The water rations ran out quickly. Men began dying of dehydration and exposure. Eliza, heavily pregnant in a small boat with minimal shade, suffered terribly. The heat, the lack of water, the constant motion of the boat, the fear and stress, all of it took its toll. She went into labor in the boat, delivering her baby under the worst possible circumstances. The infant died almost immediately, or was stillborn. The accounts vary. Eliza had to endure not just the physical trauma of childbirth in a boat, but the emotional agony of losing her child, of having no way to properly bury the tiny body, of continuing to survive when her baby hadn't. More crew members died as days stretched into weeks. Their bodies were committed to the sea, the traditional burial for sailors, but made more terrible by the circumstances. These weren't men who'd died peacefully after long lives, but sailors who'd perished miserably from thirst and exposure after their ship was lost. The survivors grew weaker, more desperate, increasingly convinced they would all die before reaching safety. Finally, in early June, the boats reached land. Specifically, they reached an island that the indigenous inhabitants called K'gari, pronounced Guri, meaning paradise in their language. This island, over 120 kilometers long and up to 25 kilometers wide, is the largest sand island in the world, covered with rainforests, freshwater lakes, and diverse ecosystems. It had been home to the Butchella people for thousands of years, who had developed sophisticated knowledge of how to live sustainably on the island. The survivors staggered ashore in terrible condition. They were dehydrated, starving, sunburned, exhausted, traumatized by watching comrades die. Some could barely walk. They desperately needed food, water, shelter, and rest. They'd landed on an island with all these resources, but they had no knowledge of how to access them. They didn't know which plants were edible, where fresh water could be found, how to catch the local animals. They were utterly dependent on help from anyone they encountered. The Butchella people discovered these strange foreign arrivals on their island. Imagine their perspective. A group of pale-skinned strangers appear from the sea, speaking a language nobody understands, wearing bizarre clothes, clearly dying from basic failure to survive in an environment the Butchella had lived in successfully for millennia. The strangers had sophisticated items, metal tools, woven cloth, complex equipment, but lacked basic survival knowledge. It must have seemed both fascinating and somewhat pathetic. What happened next is where the story becomes complicated, where accounts diverge, where truth gets obscured by later lies and propaganda. According to some accounts, including later testimony from Eliza herself, though her testimony changed repeatedly and contained obvious fabrications, the Butchella took the survivors in, but treated them as low-status people who had to work for their food and shelter. This wouldn't have been unusual. Many indigenous societies integrated outsiders at the bottom of social hierarchies, expecting them to prove their worth before gaining full acceptance. The survivors were separated into different groups within the Butchella community structure. Captain Fraser and Eliza were separated from each other, placed with different family groups or clans. This separation was normal in Butchella society, where people lived in extended family units rather than nuclear family pairs. but it must have been terrifying for the Frasers, who couldn't communicate with their hosts and didn't understand why they were being separated. The Butchella expected the survivors to contribute to communal labor, gathering food, collecting firewood, helping with daily tasks that kept the community functioning. For people accustomed to British class hierarchies, where Captain Fraser was an authority figure and Eliza was a lady who didn't perform manual labor, this was a shock. But the Butchella didn't recognize British ranks or gender roles. Everyone who consumed resources was expected to contribute labor. It was simple communal logic. Captain Fraser, already weakened by the ordeal in the boats, apparently couldn't handle the physical demands of Butchella life. He was older, injured, unused to the type of work expected. His health deteriorated rapidly. Within weeks of arriving on the island, Captain James Fraser died. The exact cause and circumstances of his death became one of the many contested points in the story. Later accounts would claim various things, from illness to conflict with the Butchella, each version serving different narrative purposes. Eliza was now widowed, alone among people whose language she didn't speak, whose culture she didn't understand, mourning a husband and a child, thousands of kilometers from anyone who knew her. She was completely dependent on the Butchella for survival, but had no way to communicate with them effectively. No way to explain her situation or plead her case. She was trapped on the island, with no apparent means of escape. Her situation was genuinely desperate, regardless of what truths or lies she would later tell about it. Eliza Fraser's time living with the Butchella people on Ngari Island lasted approximately 6 weeks, from early June until late July 1836. These weeks would become the most controversial and disputed period of her life, the subject of countless retellings, the source of stories that changed with each narration, the foundation for claims that would have devastating consequences for Indigenous Australians. Understanding what actually happened requires separating established facts from Eliza's later fabrications. The established facts are limited, but important. Eliza lived within a Butchella community group for about 6 weeks. She survived this period, which proves the Butchella provided her with food, water, and shelter. Without these basics, she would have died, as her husband had. She emerged from the experience physically marked by her ordeal, but fundamentally intact, without serious injuries that would indicate systematic violence. Several other survivors from the Stirling Castle also lived among different Butchella groups and also survived, which suggests a pattern of the Indigenous people keeping the shipwreck survivors alive, rather than harming them. What Eliza experienced during those 6 weeks depended heavily on perspective and interpretation. The Butchella were teaching her how to survive on their island, showing her which foods were safe to eat, how to gather them, how to prepare them. But Eliza, coming from British society where ladies didn't perform manual labor and where servants did such work, experienced this teaching as forced labor, as degradation, as punishment, rather than education. The Butchella diet consisted of foods Eliza had never encountered and initially found repellent. They ate various roots and tubers gathered from the bush, seafood, including fish and shellfish, certain insects that were nutritious, small animals, native plants with medicinal or nutritional properties. To Eliza, accustomed to British cooking and ingredients, these foods seemed bizarre and disgusting. But they were keeping her alive, providing the calories and nutrients she needed to survive. The Butchella almost certainly applied traditional body decorations to Eliza, likely including clay or ochre pigments rubbed on skin. This was standard practice in their culture, serving multiple purposes: sun protection in the harsh Australian climate, insect repellent, spiritual significance, group identification. But Eliza, not understanding the cultural context, experienced this as bizarre ritual, as being marked or claimed in ways she found frightening and degrading. The communication barrier was enormous and created constant misunderstandings. The Butchella spoke languages from the Butchella language family, completely unrelated to English and incomprehensible to Eliza. She had no way to ask questions, explain her situation, request specific help, or understand what people were saying about her or expecting from her. Every interaction was a guessing game, with both sides frequently misunderstanding each other's intentions and meanings. The Butchella likely viewed Eliza with a mixture of curiosity, pity, and frustration. She was a strange, foreign woman who'd appeared from the sea, who didn't know basic survival skills that Butchella children learned, who couldn't understand simple instructions, who was completely incompetent at tasks that were routine for everyone else. They were keeping her alive out of humanitarian impulse or cultural obligation, but she was undoubtedly a burden, someone who consumed resources without contributing much useful labor because she lacked necessary skills. Eliza's physical condition during this period was poor, but not because of deliberate mistreatment. She'd already been weakened by weeks in the boats with minimal food and water. She'd given birth and lost her child. She'd watched her husband die. She was living in a tropical climate her body wasn't adapted to, exposed to sun and insects her skin couldn't handle, eating foods her digestive system wasn't accustomed to. She would have lost weight, developed sores and skin conditions, suffered from various ailments regardless of how well the Butchella treated her. The work expected of Eliza was genuinely hard by her standards. Gathering food in the bush meant walking long distances, digging in hard ground with primitive tools, carrying heavy loads. Collecting firewood meant dragging fallen branches through the forest. Preparing food meant grinding seeds, cleaning fish, processing plant materials, all labor-intensive tasks. But this was daily life for Butchella women, normal, routine work that kept their communities fed and functioning. They weren't punishing Eliza specifically. They were expecting her to contribute to her own survival like everyone else did. There's no credible evidence that Eliza was physically abused by the Butchella people during this time. The physical marks and conditions documented when she was rescued were consistent with 6 weeks of living rough in the Australian bush, not with systematic beating or torture. Later medical examinations found no broken bones, no knife wounds, no signs of the kind of violence she would later claim to have experienced. She was malnourished and covered in sores and insect bites, but so would anyone be after her ordeal. The Butchella society she was living in was sophisticated and complex, though Eliza would never acknowledge this. The people had lived successfully on Gari for thousands of years, developing extensive knowledge of the island's ecology, sustainable harvesting practices, sophisticated social and kinship systems, rich spiritual and cultural traditions. They weren't savages stumbling through primitive existence. They were people, with complex culture and deep connection to their environment. But Eliza couldn't see any of this. She saw only that these people looked different, spoke incomprehensible languages, ate strange foods, lived without the material goods she associated with civilization, practiced customs she found bizarre. In her British worldview, her culture represented civilization, and all other cultures represented various degrees of savagery. She'd been taught since childhood that British people were superior, that their way of life was the only proper way, that Indigenous peoples worldwide were inferior beings who needed to be civilized or eliminated. These prejudices meant Eliza interpreted everything through a lens of fear and contempt. Helpful teaching about edible plants became forced labor. Traditional body decorations became degrading marks of ownership. Normal expectations about contributing labor became cruel punishment. The Butchella people, trying to keep her alive, despite the burden she represented, became captors, tormenting a victim. Every interaction was filtered through assumptions of indigenous savagery that prevented her from seeing the humanity and complexity of the people around her. Eliza attempted escape several times during her 6 weeks on the island, which makes sense given her perspective. She believed she was captive, believed she was in danger, believed she needed to get away. But her escape attempts were futile. She didn't know the island, had no survival skills, had no idea where British settlements were or how to reach them. The Butchella brought her back each time, not because they wanted to imprison her, but because letting her wander off alone meant she'd die of dehydration or exposure within days. The other Stirling Castle survivors were dispersed among different Butchella groups, experiencing similar situations to Eliza's. Some adapted better, learning basic communication, accepting the food and customs, understanding they were guests dependent on their host's goodwill. Others, like Eliza, remained terrified and resistant, viewing every day as a nightmare of captivity. These different reactions would later create conflicts in testimony. Survivors who'd had less hostile experiences would contradict Eliza's most extreme claims. As weeks passed, word about the shipwreck and survivors spread among the Butchella clans and eventually reached the British settlements on the mainland. The Indigenous people understood that these foreign survivors needed to be returned to their own people. They weren't trying to permanently incorporate them or keep them as slaves, despite what later propaganda would claim. They were keeping the survivors alive until they could be safely transferred back to British custody. Rescue was coming, though Eliza didn't know it yet. The process of communication between Indigenous people and British authorities was complex and slow, requiring multiple intermediaries who could bridge the language and cultural gaps. But it was happening. Eliza's ordeal was approaching its end, though the consequences of how she'd remember and describe her experience were only beginning. The 6 weeks on K'gari would be transformed in her tellings into months of systematic torture. The helpful teaching would become cruel abuse. The people who'd kept her alive would become savage monsters. The lies were about to begin. News of the Stirling Castle's wrecking reached the British authorities in Brisbane, then called Moreton Bay, through a complex chain of communication involving Indigenous peoples, escaped convicts living among Aboriginal groups, and eventually British officials. One survivor had apparently managed to reach the mainland earlier and reported the disaster, triggering rescue efforts. But organizing a rescue mission to K'gari involved significant challenges. The island was remote. Reaching it required navigating dangerous waters, and making contact with Indigenous groups required intermediaries who could bridge the language and cultural gaps. The key figure in Eliza's rescue was a man named John Graham, though some sources use different names or conflate multiple people involved in the rescue efforts. Graham was an escaped convict who'd been living among Indigenous peoples for years and had learned their languages and customs. In the complex social landscape of early colonial Australia, such men occupied ambiguous positions. They were criminals fleeing British justice, but also valuable intermediaries who could facilitate communication between Indigenous and colonial societies. Graham made contact with the Butchella people holding Eliza, negotiating for her release. The negotiation required explaining who she was, why British authorities wanted her back, what benefits might accrue to the Butchella for releasing her peacefully. Graham's linguistic and cultural knowledge made the negotiation possible. Without someone who could bridge the communication gap, rescue would have required military force, with likely bloodshed on both sides. The Butchella agreed to release Eliza. Some accounts suggest they were relieved to transfer responsibility for this difficult foreign woman back to her own people. She'd been a burden, requiring resources and care, while contributing little labor because of her lack of skills and understanding. The Butchella had fulfilled their humanitarian obligation to keep her alive, but there was no benefit to keeping her permanently. Transferring her back to British custody made practical sense. When Graham and the rescue party first saw Eliza in late July 1836, she presented a shocking appearance. She was emaciated from weeks of inadequate nutrition. By British standards, the Butchella diet was healthy, but didn't provide the calories her body expected. Her skin was marked with traditional decorations, covered with insect bites and sores from exposure to the harsh Australian environment. Her clothes were torn or absent, replaced with traditional coverings or nothing. She looked nothing like a British lady, more like someone who'd been living rough in the bush for weeks. Which is exactly what she had been doing. Eliza was transported back to Moreton Bay and immediately became the subject of intense interest. Shipwreck survivors always attracted attention, but Eliza's story had exceptional dramatic elements. A woman, a captain's widow, pregnant when the ship wrecked, had survived weeks living among savages on a remote island. In an era when sensational stories spread through newspapers and word of mouth, when entertainment options were limited and real-life dramas filled the cultural space later occupied by novels and films, Eliza's experience was inherently fascinating. She was received by the authorities and given medical care, proper food, clean clothes, all the material comforts of civilization she'd been deprived of for weeks. She was questioned about her experience, asked to provide accounts of what had happened to the Stirling Castle, and what had occurred during her time on Kagari. These initial testimonies would form the foundation of the official record, but they were already colored by trauma, prejudice, and perhaps conscious or unconscious exaggeration. Eliza's first accounts of her experience emphasized her suffering and painted the Butchella in extremely negative terms. She described being forced to work beyond her strength, being given inadequate food, being treated cruelly by people she characterized as savages. She claimed her husband had died from mistreatment rather than from injuries and illness. She suggested she'd been in constant danger, that only the rescue had saved her from death or worse fates she hinted at, but didn't specify explicitly. These initial stories satisfied multiple audiences with different interests. Colonial authorities wanted to believe Indigenous peoples were dangerous and uncivilized, justifying the colonial project of dispossessing, controlling them. The general public wanted exciting narratives of white women suffering among dark-skinned savages, stories that confirmed their racial prejudices and provided thrilling entertainment. Eliza wanted sympathy and material support, which required portraying herself as a victim deserving aid, rather than as someone who'd simply experienced hardship that Indigenous people routinely survived. But even in these early accounts, inconsistencies appeared. Other survivors from the Stirling Castle told different stories, describing the Butchella as helpful rather than cruel, as people who'd kept them alive rather than threatened them. These survivors hadn't been separated from Indigenous contact as Eliza had spent their rescue period comparing experiences, and their collective testimony contradicted many of Eliza's claims about systematic violence and cruelty. The colonial authorities and public were more interested in Eliza's dramatic narrative than in the other, survivors' more nuanced accounts. A story about Indigenous peoples helping shipwreck survivors wasn't useful for colonial purposes and wasn't exciting for public consumption. A story about a white woman suffering among savages supported the colonial ideology that British civilization was bringing order to a barbarous land, and it provided the sensational content that newspapers needed to sell copies. Eliza quickly discovered that her dramatic stories brought rewards. Sympathetic officials and colonists donated money to help the poor widow who'd suffered so much. Newspapers published her accounts, making her famous. She received attention and support that would have been unavailable if she'd simply told a boring story about hardship and survival. The incentive structure encouraged exaggeration and favored the most dramatic narrative over the most accurate one. Within weeks of her rescue, Eliza had become a minor celebrity in the Australian colonies. Her story was being told and retold, each retelling embellishing details, adding dramatic elements, sharpening the contrast between civilized British woman and savage Indigenous captors. The process of myth-making had begun, transforming 6 weeks of difficult but not extraordinary survival into an epic tale of suffering and endurance. Eliza made the decision to return to Britain rather than remaining in Australia. There were practical reasons. She had no husband, no means of support, no reason to stay in a colony where she had no connections. But there were also financial reasons. The Australian colonies had limited population and wealth. Britain, with its millions of residents and larger economy, offered far greater opportunities for someone with a sensational story to tell. She could give lectures, sell her story to newspapers, receive donations from sympathetic audiences. Britain was where the money was. She departed Australia in late 1836, leaving behind the other Stirling Castle survivors whose testimonies might have complicated her narrative. She was bringing with her the most marketable commodity she possessed, an increasingly dramatic story about her ordeal, a story that would grow more elaborate and more false with each retelling. She'd discovered that people would pay for suffering narratives, especially when those narratives confirmed their prejudices about racial superiority and Indigenous savagery. During the voyage back to Britain, Eliza had months to refine her story, to practice her narrative, to determine which elements provoked the strongest reactions from audiences. She could test different versions on fellow passengers, seeing what details made people gasp or weep or reach for their purses to donate money. She was becoming a professional storyteller, crafting her narrative for maximum emotional and financial impact. She arrived in Britain in early 1837 to find that news of her ordeal had preceded her. Colonial newspapers had sent reports that British publications had picked up and republished. Eliza Fraser was already somewhat famous before she'd even reached British shores, which meant there was an eager audience waiting to hear her story directly from her own lips. She'd been given a gift, public attention and sympathy that she could convert into money and security if she played her role correctly. The stage was set for the creation of one of colonial history's most pernicious myths. Eliza Fraser would spend the next several years elaborating her story, adding details, intensifying the drama, transforming her genuine hardship into fabricated horror story. The Butchella people who'd kept her alive would be portrayed as monsters. The 6 weeks of rough but survivable conditions would become months of systematic torture. Every element would be exaggerated to serve Eliza's financial interests and to confirm British audiences' worst assumptions about Indigenous peoples. The lies that would justify violence and dispossession for generations were about to be perfected and widely distributed. Truth was about to become the first casualty of Eliza Fraser's success. Eliza Fraser arrived in London in 1837 to find herself in a peculiar position. She was famous but poor, celebrated but desperate for money, the subject of intense public interest but with no reliable income. Victorian Britain offered few respectable options for women to earn money, especially widows without family wealth or useful skills. But Eliza had something valuable, a story that people wanted to hear, one that pushed all the right buttons for British audiences hungry for tales of colonial adventure and racial superiority. She quickly discovered that the more dramatic her story became, the more money she could extract from sympathetic audiences. She began giving public talks about her ordeal, sometimes for organized groups willing to pay for the entertainment, sometimes informally to wealthy patrons who might donate money to help the poor widow who'd suffered so much among the savages. Each telling added new details, intensified the suffering, made the Butchella people seem more cruel and threatening. The transformation of her narrative followed predictable patterns. Elements that in early tellings had been described as hardship became torture in later versions. Being given unfamiliar foods became deliberate starvation. Being expected to work became forced labor under constant threat. Traditional body decorations became degrading marks of ownership. Normal cultural practices became evidence of savagery and cruelty. Eliza began claiming she'd been held captive for far longer than 6 weeks. Some versions extended her time to 3 months or more, multiplying the duration to make the suffering seem more extreme. She claimed to have witnessed or experienced violence that left no physical evidence, and that contradicted testimony from other survivors. She suggested sexual threats and violence that she described in euphemistic terms acceptable for Victorian audiences, while making the implications clear enough to provoke horror and sympathy. The British public ate up these stories hungrily. They confirmed everything Victorians wanted to believe about themselves and about the indigenous peoples their empire was conquering worldwide. British civilization was superior, bringing enlightenment to dark places. Indigenous peoples were savages who needed to be controlled, educated, or eliminated for their own good and for the safety of civilized people. White women were in constant danger from dark-skinned men, requiring British men to protect them through colonial domination. Newspapers published Eliza's accounts prominently, often embellishing them further in the retelling. Journalists added dramatic language, created dialogue that nobody had actually heard, illustrated stories with engravings showing monstrous-looking indigenous people threatening helpless white women. The press and Eliza entered a symbiotic relationship. She provided sensational content that sold newspapers. Newspapers provided publicity that helped her raise money. The money came in from multiple sources. Sympathetic members of the public donated directly to help the poor widow. Charitable organizations provided support. She may have received payments for published versions of her story or for speaking engagements. The specific amounts aren't well documented, but it's clear she was receiving enough money to live on, which meant she had strong financial incentives to continue telling increasingly dramatic versions of her experience. But Eliza faced a problem that eventually undermined her credibility. The other survivors from the Stirling Castle were also in Britain, and some of them told very different stories. They described the Butchella people as having helped them, having shared food and knowledge, having kept them alive when they would otherwise have died. They couldn't corroborate Eliza's claims about systematic torture or constant danger. Their testimonies made Eliza look like either a liar or someone whose suffering had been uniquely worse than everyone else's for unexplained reasons. The contradictions created awkward situations. When newspapers published competing accounts, when survivors confronted Eliza's claims directly, she had to explain the discrepancies. She typically responded by suggesting the other survivors hadn't experienced what she had, that she'd been treated worse because of her status as the captain's wife, or because she'd resisted more, or for various other reasons that couldn't be verified. She maintained her narrative in the face of contradiction, doubling down rather than admitting exaggeration. Some people began to suspect Eliza wasn't entirely truthful. The contradictions with other survivors' accounts, the way her story grew more elaborate with each telling, the convenient additions of new dramatic details whenever her story was getting stale, all of this suggested embellishment at minimum, possibly outright fabrication. But most of her audience wanted to believe her. The story was too good, too satisfying to their prejudices, too exciting as entertainment. They chose belief over skepticism. Eliza's personal life during this period was complicated and somewhat scandalous. Despite presenting herself as a grieving widow dependent on public charity, she was actually living quite comfortably on the donations she received, and sometime in 1837 or 1838, she remarried to a ship's captain named Alexander Green, which she kept secret from most of her public audience, because being remarried undermined her image as a struggling widow deserving continued sympathy and support. When the secret marriage was eventually discovered and publicized, Eliza's reputation took its first serious hit. People felt deceived. They'd been donating money to help a poor widow who turned out to be living as a comfortably remarried woman. Some of her financial support dried up as donors felt manipulated. Newspapers that had previously supported her began questioning her honesty more generally. If she'd lied about being single, what else had she lied about? But the damage to her personal reputation didn't undo the damage her lies had done to the Butchella people and to Indigenous Australians generally. Her stories had entered public consciousness, had been repeated and elaborated by others, had become part of how British people understood Indigenous peoples. The lies had taken on lives of their own, independent of whether anyone believed Eliza personally anymore. Her stories were being used for political purposes she probably never intended, but that served colonial interests perfectly. Politicians and colonial administrators cited Eliza Fraser's ordeal as evidence that Indigenous peoples were dangerous, that they needed to be controlled through force, that allowing them to remain independent threatened white women and children. Her testimony became ammunition in debates about how aggressively to pursue colonial expansion and Indigenous dispossession. Missionaries used her stories to justify their work trying to Christianize Indigenous peoples, arguing that people capable of treating a white woman so cruelly were desperately in need of salvation and civilization. Military officers cited her experience when arguing for larger budgets and more aggressive policies toward Indigenous resistance. Settlers claimed they needed weapons and military protection because otherwise they might suffer Eliza Fraser's fate. Every interest group that benefited from depicting Indigenous peoples as dangerous savages found her stories useful. The real Butchella people on Hkari knew none of this. They had no idea that the strange foreign woman they'd kept alive for 6 weeks had become famous by telling lies about them, that her fabrications were being used to justify violence and dispossession of Indigenous peoples across Australia. They continued living their lives, hunting and gathering on their island, practicing their customs, maintaining their culture, unaware that their entire way of life was being targeted by forces mobilized partly through distortions of their treatment of shipwreck survivors. Back in Britain, Eliza's fame was fading by the early 1840s. The public had heard her story many times, the novelty had worn off, newer sensations were capturing attention. She'd exhausted the financial possibilities of her story in Britain. She and her new husband decided to emigrate to New Zealand, where they could start fresh and where Eliza's past notoriety might be less of a burden. She spent the rest of her life in relative obscurity, living in New Zealand under her new married name, trying to build normal life away from the scandal and contradictions that had surrounded her in Britain. She died in 1858 in Melbourne, Australia, having returned from New Zealand for reasons that aren't clear, killed in a carriage accident at age 62. Her death received minimal notice in the press. The woman who'd once been famous had been largely forgotten by the time she died. But the consequences of her lies lived on. Her stories had helped create a narrative framework that portrayed Indigenous Australians as dangerous savages who threatened white women. A narrative that justified violence and dispossession for generations after her death. The island where she'd spent 6 weeks was renamed Fraser Island after her husband, erasing the indigenous name Gari and replacing it with a name honoring someone whose death there had been used to demonize the people who'd lived there for thousands of years. Eliza Fraser's lies had effects far beyond her own lifetime, creating damage that persisted long after anyone could hold her personally accountable. To understand the full impact of Eliza Fraser's lies, we need to understand who the Butchella people actually were. Not the monstrous savages of her fabricated narratives, but the real human beings, with complex culture and sophisticated knowledge of their environment. The contrast between Eliza's portrayal and historical reality reveals just how distorted her testimony was, and how much harm those distortions caused. The Butchella, also spelled Butchella or Butchella, were Indigenous Australians who had lived on Ngari and the adjacent mainland for thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands. Archaeological evidence shows continuous human habitation of the region extending back into the deep past, making the Butchella one of the world's oldest continuous cultures. They weren't primitive people struggling to survive. They were sophisticated inhabitants of a challenging environment they understood intimately. Ngari Island itself is an extraordinary place, the largest sand island in the world, over 120 kilometers long, with diverse ecosystems, including rainforests growing in pure sand, over 100 freshwater lakes, extensive dune systems, and unique geological features. Living successfully on this island required extensive knowledge that the Butchella had accumulated and refined over countless generations. They knew which plants were edible and how to prepare them, where water could be found in every season, how to catch fish and marine animals, how to navigate the forests, and avoid dangerous wildlife. Their social organization was complex, based on kinship systems that regulated marriage, inheritance, rights to land and resources, and social obligations. They weren't living in chaotic disorder, but in carefully structured communities, with clear rules about appropriate behavior, methods for resolving disputes, and systems for maintaining social harmony. Their culture included elaborate spiritual beliefs, artistic traditions, oral histories that preserved knowledge across generations, and ceremonies that reinforced community bonds and transmitted cultural knowledge. The Butchella had established trade networks with other indigenous groups on the mainland, exchanging goods and information, maintaining relationships that extended beyond their immediate island territory. They traveled between Ngari and the mainland in sophisticated canoes they developed for navigating the sometimes dangerous waters of the strait. They weren't isolated primitives, but people connected to broader indigenous social and economic networks. Their treatment of the Stirling Castle survivors reflected cultural values about hospitality and obligation. Many Indigenous Australian cultures had strong traditions of helping strangers in need, of sharing resources with people who lacked them, of taking responsibility for vulnerable people who entered their territory. The Butchella didn't just abandon the shipwreck survivors to die. They integrated them into their communities, fed them, taught them survival skills, kept them alive until they could be returned to their own people. This help wasn't charity in the Western sense, but obligation flowing from cultural values and practical considerations. Someone dying on your land was spiritually dangerous in many Indigenous belief systems. Keeping people alive maintained good relations with other groups who might reciprocate in future. Demonstrating hospitality enhanced a community's reputation. The Butchella had multiple reasons to help the survivors beyond simple human kindness, though that was probably a factor too. The work they expected from Eliza and other survivors was the normal labor expected from any community member. Butchella society didn't have a class of people who consumed resources without contributing labor. Everyone who was physically capable worked, regardless of gender or status. This wasn't oppression, but the basic social contract that kept communities fed and functioning. Eliza's British class background meant she expected to be treated as a lady who didn't work, but the Butchella had no such class divisions and wouldn't have understood why anyone would expect to eat without working. The foods they gave Eliza were nutritious and healthy by any objective standard, though unfamiliar to European palates. Bush tucker, the Australian Indigenous term for traditional foods, includes incredible diversity. Various yams and tubers rich in carbohydrates, numerous types of edible plants, marine foods high in protein and healthy fats, certain insects that provide concentrated nutrition. Modern nutritionists recognize traditional indigenous diets as healthier than many Western diets, with better balance of nutrients and lower rates of the chronic diseases associated with processed foods. The traditional decorations applied to Eliza's skin served practical purposes beyond cultural significance. Ochre and clay pigments provided sun protection in the harsh Australian climate, preventing the severe sunburn pale European skin would otherwise suffer. Some traditional mixtures had insect repellent properties, reducing bites from mosquitoes and other bugs that could carry disease. The Butchella were teaching Eliza survival techniques developed over thousands of years. But she interpreted their help as degradation because it violated her cultural assumptions about proper appearance. The Butchella language Eliza couldn't understand was sophisticated and complex, with grammatical structures and vocabulary adequate for expressing everything needed in their lives. All human languages are equally complex and capable. The notion that some languages are primitive is linguistic prejudice without scientific basis. The Butchella had words for hundreds of different plants and animals, for complex kinship relationships, for geographic features, for abstract concepts like obligation and reciprocity. Their inability to speak English didn't indicate inferior intelligence, any more than Eliza's inability to speak their language indicated hers. When Eliza attempted escape, the Butchella brought her back not to imprison her, but to save her life. She had no survival skills, didn't know the island, would have died quickly from dehydration or exposure if left to wander alone. Bringing her back was the responsible action by people who understood their environment far better than she did. But Eliza interpreted this life-saving action as captivity, as evidence that the Butchella were holding her against her will, when they were actually preventing her from accidentally killing herself through ignorance. The separation of Eliza from her husband reflected normal Butchella living patterns, where people lived in extended family groups rather than nuclear family units, and where women and men often occupied different spaces and performed different roles. It wasn't designed to torture Eliza psychologically, but was simply how the Butchella organized their communities. The fact that Captain Fraser died while Eliza survived suggests he may have been kept in less favorable conditions or given less help, contradicting her narrative that she was uniquely targeted for mistreatment. The Butchella's willingness to release Eliza when British representatives requested it shows they weren't trying to permanently keep her or integrate her into their society. They fulfilled their obligation to keep her alive, then transferred her back to her own people when that became possible. This was orderly and humanitarian behavior, not the actions of savage captors that Eliza would later describe. What the Butchella got in return for their humanitarian actions was demonization. Eliza's lies portrayed them as cruel savages, stories that were then used to justify increasing colonial control of Khari and the surrounding region. Within decades of Eliza's rescue, the Butchella were being forcibly removed from their lands, their children taken to mission schools where they were forbidden to speak their language or practice their culture, their population decimated by European diseases and violence. The renaming of Khari as Fraser Island was a particular insult, taking the indigenous name that meant paradise and replacing it with a name honoring the husband of the woman whose lies had demonized them. Every time someone said Fraser Island, they were repeating a colonial appropriation that erased indigenous presence and celebrated someone who'd used false testimony about indigenous people for personal gain. The island itself became a monument to colonial dishonesty. The Butchella people continued living on Khari and the adjacent mainland despite colonial pressures, maintaining their culture and identity through enormous challenges. They preserved their languages, their stories, their connection to country, even as colonial society tried to erase them. They remembered their own history, which included the truth about what had happened with the Stirling Castle survivors, that they'd helped these strangers, kept them alive, returned them safely. For generations, Butchella people tried to correct the false narrative Eliza Fraser had created, tried to explain that they'd been helpers, not tormentors, that the stories about savage cruelty were lies. But their voices were ignored by colonial society that preferred Eliza's dramatic fiction to indigenous people's truth. The pattern would repeat across Australia and around the world. Indigenous peoples telling truth about their history and colonial experiences. Colonial societies preferring comforting lies that justified dispossession and violence. Only in recent decades have historians and the broader Australian public begun seriously reconsidering the Eliza Fraser story, examining the contradictions in her accounts, listening to indigenous testimonies, recognizing that her narrative served colonial propaganda purposes. The process of historical correction is slow and incomplete, but at least there's now acknowledgement that Eliza Fraser was an unreliable narrator, whose stories shouldn't be taken at face value, and that the Butchella people deserved better than to be demonized for their humanitarian actions. Eliza Fraser's fabricated stories didn't exist in isolation. They were amplified, distorted further, and weaponized by a vast colonial propaganda apparatus that needed exactly the kind of narrative she provided. Understanding how her lies caused such lasting damage requires examining the broader context of colonial ideology in the 19th century and how personal stories became political tools that justified violence and dispossession on a massive scale. The British Empire in the 1830s and 1840s was at the height of its power and territorial expansion. It controlled colonies on every continent, ruled over hundreds of millions of people, and operated on an ideology that justified this domination through claims of racial and cultural superiority. The British saw themselves as bringing civilization to barbarous lands, Christianity to heathen peoples, order to chaos. This self-conception required constant reinforcement through narratives that portrayed colonized peoples as inferior, dangerous, and in need of British control. Australia presented particular challenges for colonial ideology. Unlike India or parts of Africa where complex civilizations with cities, writing systems, and hierarchical governments existed, Indigenous Australians lived in ways that Europeans struggled to recognize as civilized at all. They had no agriculture, no permanent settlements, no written language, no obvious political hierarchies. To European eyes, conditioned to associate civilization with cities and agriculture, Indigenous Australians seemed to represent the most primitive stage of human development. This perception was completely wrong. Indigenous Australians had sophisticated cultures, complex social organizations, extensive ecological knowledge, and rich spiritual traditions. But their sophistication was invisible to colonizers who couldn't see past surface differences. And this invisibility was convenient for colonial purposes because it made Indigenous peoples seem less fully human, making the dispossession and mistreatment easier to justify morally. Into this ideological landscape dropped Eliza Fraser's story, a narrative that perfectly fit what colonizers wanted to believe. Here was a white woman, pregnant and vulnerable, who'd suffered at the hands of savages, who'd treated her cruelly despite her obvious need for help and protection. Her story confirmed that Indigenous peoples were dangerous, that white women needed protection from them, that British military force and colonial control were necessary to prevent such horrors from recurring. The story was picked up by newspapers across the British Empire and used to illustrate broader points about colonial necessity. Editorial writers used Eliza's experience as evidence in arguments about policy toward Indigenous peoples. Should settlers be allowed to shoot Indigenous people who threatened them? Eliza Fraser's ordeal suggested yes. Should more troops be sent to protect colonial settlements? Her suffering demonstrated the need. Should Indigenous peoples be forcibly removed from lands near white settlements? Her captivity showed why this was necessary for safety. Politicians in Britain and in Australian colonial legislatures referenced her story in debates about Indigenous policy. Those arguing for aggressive expansion and harsh treatment of Indigenous resistance could point to Eliza Fraser as proof that Indigenous peoples were cruel and dangerous. Those arguing for more humanitarian approaches were put on the defensive, forced to explain why policies should be merciful toward peoples capable of such cruelty. Her fabricated testimony shifted political discourse in directions that enabled more violent colonial policies. Missionaries used her story in their fundraising and advocacy. They argued that peoples capable of treating a Christian woman so cruelly were in desperate need of salvation and civilization. They established missions on Gari and throughout Australia, with the stated goal of protecting Indigenous peoples from their own savagery by converting them to Christianity and European ways of life. The missions became sites of cultural destruction, where Indigenous children were separated from families, languages were forbidden, traditional practices were suppressed, all justified partly through reference to cases like Eliza Fraser's that supposedly demonstrated Indigenous moral depravity. Military and police forces cited her experience when requesting larger budgets and broader authority to control Indigenous peoples. Officers argued they needed more troops, more weapons, more legal authority to use force, because otherwise white settlers might suffer Eliza Fraser's fate. The result was escalating violence against Indigenous peoples throughout Australia. Violence that was presented as necessary protection for white women and children, even though Indigenous peoples posed minimal actual threat to settlers and were far more often victims than perpetrators of violence. The story became part of popular culture through multiple channels. It appeared in books, plays, songs, and eventually films that spread the false narrative to ever wider audiences. Each retelling added new dramatic elements, moved further from whatever truth had existed initially, and reinforced stereotypes about savage Indigenous peoples threatening civilized white women. The story took on mythical proportions, becoming more symbol than history, more propaganda than account of actual events. Educational materials used the Eliza Fraser story to teach children about colonial history. School books in Australia and Britain included accounts of her ordeal, presented as factual history, despite the contradictions and fabrications. Generations of children learned that Indigenous Australians had cruelly mistreated a helpless white woman, learning racial prejudices as if they were historical facts. The lies became embedded in colonial education, reproducing themselves across generations. The propaganda impact was amplified by the story's emotional power. The image of a pregnant white woman suffering among dark-skinned savages triggered multiple prejudices simultaneously about race, gender, civilization, and danger. It activated protective instincts toward white women, fears about sexual violence, implied but never explicitly described, assumptions about racial hierarchy, and beliefs about European civilizational superiority. A single story pushed multiple ideological buttons, making it extraordinarily effective as propaganda. Eliza herself probably never intended her lies to cause the massive harm they did. She was motivated primarily by financial need and desire for attention, not by conscious intent to enable genocide or cultural destruction. But her personal motivations became irrelevant once her stories entered the propaganda system. Other people took her fabrications and used them for purposes she, likely, never imagined, purposes far more harmful than her original self-interested lies. The colonial propaganda machine amplified some elements of her story while downplaying others. The parts about Indigenous cruelty were emphasized and exaggerated. The parts that complicated the narrative, like other survivors' testimony contradicting her claims, or evidence that the Butchella had actually kept her alive rather than threatening her death, were minimized or ignored. The story was shaped to serve propaganda purposes, with inconvenient truths discarded in favor of useful lies. This selective amplification created a version of events so distorted that it bore little relationship to what had actually happened. Eliza's 6 weeks of rough but survivable conditions became months of systematic torture in the propaganda version. The Butchella people's humanitarian decision to keep her alive became sadistic captivity. Their teaching about survival became forced labor. Their traditional practices became evidence of savagery. Every element was inverted, transformed into its opposite, weaponized against the people who'd actually helped. The geographic reach of the propaganda was enormous. Eliza's story was known throughout the British Empire, in European countries following British colonial news, in America, where similar narratives about Indigenous peoples served similar ideological purposes. It became one of the most famous captivity narratives of the colonial era, referenced alongside other stories of white people supposedly suffering among non-white peoples, all of them used to justify colonial violence and dispossession. The lasting impact on Ngari and the Butchella people was devastating. The island became firmly established in colonial minds as a dangerous place where savage people lived, a place that needed to be brought under control and civilized. This perception enabled escalating colonial intervention, military expeditions, forced relocations, mission establishments, land appropriations. The Butchella were gradually dispossessed of their homeland, losing access to traditional sites, being prevented from practicing traditional culture, watching their population decline from disease and violence. The renaming of Ngari as Fraser Island in the 1840s was both symbolic and practical victory for colonial ideology. It erased the Indigenous name that had existed for thousands of years, replacing it with a name that honored the husband of the woman whose lies had been used to justify Indigenous dispossession. Every map that showed Fraser Island was repeating colonial propaganda, legitimizing the false narrative, erasing Indigenous presence. The island itself became a monument to successful colonial myth-making. By the late 19th century, the Butchella had been largely removed from Ngari, relocated to mainland reserves and missions where their culture and language were actively suppressed. The colonial government prohibited traditional practices, separated children from families to be educated in European ways, enforced Christian religious observance. The goal was cultural genocide, not necessarily physical elimination, though death rates in missions and reserves were horrific, but destruction of Indigenous culture, language, and identity. And Eliza Fraser's lies had helped enable this by creating a narrative framework that portrayed Indigenous peoples as savages who needed to be controlled for everyone's safety. The propaganda success was so complete that for over a century, most Australians believed the Fraser story as Eliza had told it. School children learned it as fact. Tourists visited Fraser Island and were told stories about the poor white woman who'd suffered among savages. The lies were repeated so often, by so many people, through so many channels, that they became accepted truth, resistant to correction, even when evidence contradicted them. Only in recent decades, as Australia has begun more honestly confronting its colonial history, and as Indigenous voices have gained more hearing, has the Fraser story been seriously questioned and deconstructed. Historians have examined the contradictions in Eliza's accounts, listened to Indigenous oral histories, recognized the propaganda purposes her stories served. The process of truth-telling is slow and incomplete, but at least there's now acknowledgement that Eliza Fraser lied, that her lies caused enormous harm, and that the Butchella people deserve to have their true history recognized, rather than being remembered through the distorted lens of colonial propaganda. While Eliza Fraser's dramatic fabrications dominated public attention and shaped colonial policy, other voices existed that told very different stories about what had actually happened on Khari. These alternative testimonies were largely ignored or suppressed during the colonial era, but they survive in historical records and provide crucial evidence for reconstructing the truth about the Stirling Castle survivors' experiences. Understanding these other voices reveals just how thoroughly Eliza's lies distorted reality. The other survivors from the Stirling Castle provided testimony that contradicted Eliza's most sensational claims. These men, sailors and crew members who'd also lived among different Butchella groups for weeks, described experiences that were difficult but not cruel, marked by Indigenous help rather than torture, characterized by cultural misunderstanding rather than deliberate malice. Their accounts didn't make headlines or sell newspapers, but they were more accurate than Eliza's profitable fabrications. One survivor, whose testimony survives, described the Butchella as kind in their own fashion, explaining that they'd shared food and taught survival techniques, even though communication was difficult due to language barriers. He acknowledged the work was hard and the food unfamiliar, but he framed these as challenges of adapting to different culture, rather than evidence of cruelty. He specifically contradicted claims about systematic violence, stating he'd witnessed no unprovoked attacks and believed the Butchella had preserved their lives. Another survivor testified that he'd been separated from the main group but had been cared for by the Butchella family he lived with, given food daily, shown how to gather additional food for himself, and treated reasonably well, considering the communication difficulties and cultural differences. He described children being curious about him, but not hostile, women including him in food preparation activities, men teaching him fishing techniques. His account portrayed normal human interactions between people from very different cultures, not the nightmare of savage captivity Eliza described. The crew member who'd reached the mainland first and triggered the rescue mission described the Butchella as concerned about the survivors' welfare, as helping them when they could, interested in facilitating their return to their own people, rather than keeping them permanently. His testimony suggested the Indigenous people understood these foreigners needed to go home, and were willing to cooperate with that goal once communication was established. These alternative accounts created serious problems for Eliza's narrative. How could the Butchella have been simultaneously helping most survivors while uniquely tormenting her? Why would they treat a pregnant woman worse than able-bodied men who might have posed actual threats? The contradictions suggested either that Eliza had experienced something genuinely different from everyone else, or that she was lying about or drastically misinterpreting her experiences. The most likely explanation is that Eliza and the other survivors experienced similar conditions, but interpreted them through very different cultural lenses and personal dispositions. The male survivors were sailors accustomed to hard physical labor, sleeping rough, eating whatever was available, adapting to difficult conditions. Eliza was a middle-class woman, conditioned to expect domestic comfort, to be served rather than serving, to avoid manual labor. The same experiences that sailors viewed as uncomfortable hardship, Eliza experienced as intolerable degradation. Additionally, Eliza had suffered traumas the male survivors hadn't: losing her child, losing her husband, being separated from anyone who shared her language and culture. Her psychological state was probably worse than the men's, making her more likely to interpret ambiguous situations negatively, to see threats where none existed, to experience normal hardship as deliberate cruelty. Trauma and cultural disconnect combined to create a reality that felt much worse to Eliza than objective conditions might warrant. But the male survivors' testimonies were largely ignored by colonial audiences, more interested in Eliza's dramatic narrative. When their accounts were published, received minimal attention. When they contradicted Eliza directly, people dismissed them as men who didn't understand women's suffering, or who'd been in different situations than Eliza. The public wanted to believe the exciting story, not the boring truth that Indigenous people had helped everyone survive a difficult situation. John Graham, the escaped convict who'd negotiated Eliza's release, provided another crucial perspective. Graham had lived among Indigenous peoples for years, spoke their languages, understood their cultures. His testimony carried weight because he could actually communicate with the Butchella and understand their perspectives. And his account confirmed that the Butchella had been keeping Eliza alive, had been trying to help her adapt, had been planning to return her to British custody when that became possible. Graham described the Butchella as confused about why this foreign woman was so resistant to learning survival skills, why she kept trying to escape when she had no ability to survive alone, why she seemed to interpret every attempt to help her as an attack. From the Butchella perspective, through Graham's interpretation, Eliza was a difficult guest who wouldn't cooperate with reasonable expectations, but who needed to be kept alive nonetheless because that was the proper thing to do with vulnerable people who entered your territory. Graham's testimony also revealed that some Butchella had been frustrated with Eliza, feeling she was ungrateful for the help they were providing, demanding special treatment they couldn't understand or justify within their cultural framework. This frustration may have occasionally manifested as impatience or reduced kindness, which Eliza could have interpreted as cruelty. But Graham was clear that he'd seen no evidence of systematic mistreatment or deliberate torture of the type Eliza would later describe. Indigenous oral histories preserved within Butchella communities told yet another version of the story. These accounts, passed down through generations, described the survivors as lost strangers who needed help, as people who didn't know how to live properly, but who had to be taught and protected. Some versions expressed mild contempt for the foreigners' incompetence. How could adult people not know how to find food or water? But also pride in having fulfilled obligations to help those in need. In Butchella oral tradition, Eliza appears as a particularly difficult person who resisted learning, who complained constantly, who tried to run away despite not knowing how to survive. Some stories describe her as ungrateful, as someone who took help without appreciation, as a burden that the community bore out of obligation rather than desire. These characterizations may be unfair to Eliza, given her traumatic circumstances, but they provide Indigenous perspectives that colonial sources ignored entirely. The Butchella oral histories explicitly reject claims that they mistreated Eliza. They remember the incident as one where they helped a foreign woman survive and return to her people, fulfilling their cultural obligations despite the difficulty she created. They view her later accusations as lies, told for reasons they couldn't initially understand, but that became clearer as colonial dispossession intensified, and they realized her stories were being used to justify violence against them. Modern historians, examining all available evidence, have largely concluded that Eliza Fraser fabricated or greatly exaggerated most of her most dramatic claims. The contradictions with other survivors' testimony, the lack of physical evidence for systematic violence, the way her story grew more elaborate over time, the obvious financial incentives for sensationalism, the Indigenous oral histories contradicting her account, all of this points toward her being what scholars call an unreliable narrator, someone whose testimony can't be trusted without independent corroboration. This scholarly consensus has been slow to penetrate public consciousness. For over a century, Eliza's version dominated. Only in recent decades have historians worked to recover the suppressed testimonies, to center Indigenous voices, to reconstruct more accurate accounts of what actually happened. This work of historical correction is part of broader efforts to decolonize Australian history, to move beyond colonial myths toward more honest understanding of the past. The process has revealed uncomfortable truths about how history gets written and whose voices get heard. Eliza Fraser's lies were preserved, amplified, and accepted as truth because they served powerful interests and confirmed existing prejudices. The testimonies contradicting her were ignored or suppressed because they complicated useful narratives and challenged colonial ideology. Truth lost to convenient lies, and the consequences of that loss echoed across generations. The survival of alternative testimonies in historical archives means we can now reconstruct more accurate accounts, can recognize Eliza Fraser as unreliable narrator rather than truthful witness, can understand the Butchella as helpers rather than tormentors. But this knowledge came too late to prevent the harm her lies enabled. The dispossession had already occurred. The cultural destruction had already been inflicted. The propaganda had already shaped multiple generations' understanding of Indigenous peoples. Truth recovered after a century can correct the historical record, but can't undo historical injustice. The other voices, the male survivors, John Graham, the Butchella oral histories, the physical evidence contradicting Eliza's claims, all point toward the same conclusion. The Stirling Castle survivors were helped by Indigenous people who kept them alive when they would otherwise have died. Eliza Fraser experienced this help as degradation because of cultural differences and personal trauma. She then lied about her experiences for financial gain. And those lies were weaponized by colonial propaganda to justify violence against the people who'd saved her life. This is the truth that emerges when we listen to all the voices, rather than just the loudest one. This is what history looks like when we center evidence over myth, when we privilege accuracy over comfortable lies. The consequences of Eliza Fraser's fabrications weren't abstract or merely reputational. Her lies contributed directly to colonial policies that devastated the Butchella people and other Indigenous Australians, providing narrative justification for dispossession, cultural destruction, and violence that continued for generations. Understanding the full cost of her lies requires examining the specific ways her testimony was weaponized against Indigenous peoples and the lasting damage those weapons caused. Before Eliza Fraser's story became widely known, Gari had already experienced some colonial incursion, but the island remained substantially under Butchella control. The Indigenous people continued practicing traditional lifestyles, maintaining cultural practices, living in their ancestral territory according to customs developed over thousands of years. Colonial presence was limited primarily to occasional ship visits. Escaped convicts, who sometimes lived with Indigenous groups, and sporadic contacts with mainland settlements. The Butchella maintained substantial autonomy and territorial control. The Fraser story changed this dynamic dramatically. The narrative of a white woman suffering among savages on Kagari made the island seem dangerous in colonial imagination, a place that needed to be brought under control for the safety of any Europeans who might be shipwrecked there in future. The island's strategic location near shipping routes added urgency. If more ships wrecked nearby, colonial authorities wanted to ensure survivors would reach civilized control rather than falling into indigenous hands where they might suffer Eliza Fraser's supposed fate. Within a decade of Eliza's rescue, Gari experienced dramatically increased colonial intervention. Military expeditions were sent to establish British authority, to make clear that the island was under colonial control, to intimidate indigenous peoples into accepting European dominance. These expeditions sometimes resulted in violent confrontations, with Butchella people being shot when they resisted colonial intrusions into their territory. Each violent encounter was justified through reference to the need to protect future shipwreck survivors from savage treatment. Christian missionaries arrived on Gari in the 1850s and 1860s, establishing missions that aimed to convert the Butchella to Christianity and European civilization. The missionary logic explicitly referenced cases like Eliza Fraser's. They argued that people capable of such cruelty to a Christian woman desperately needed salvation and civilization. The missions became sites of forced cultural transformation, where indigenous children were separated from families, traditional languages were forbidden, customary practices were suppressed, and European behaviors were enforced through punishment for non-compliance. The missions operated on principles that today we recognize as cultural genocide, the deliberate destruction of a people's culture and identity. Children were taken from parents and raised in dormitory settings where they were forbidden to speak their native languages or practice traditional customs. They were given European names, European clothes, European education, European religion. The explicit goal was to eliminate indigenous culture within a generation, to create people who looked Aboriginal but thought and acted European. Physical conditions in the missions were often terrible. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded dormitories. Nutrition was inadequate. Children suffered from lack of parental care and from harsh discipline, sometimes crossed into abuse. Death rates in missions exceeded birth rates, meaning these supposed sites of salvation were actually killing the people they claimed to be helping. But missionary advocates continued justifying their work through reference to indigenous savagery, exemplified by cases like Eliza Fraser's. Meanwhile, colonial settlers were moving on to Kagari and the adjacent mainland, claiming land for farming and timber harvesting. The island's extensive forests represented valuable resources in colonial economy: timber for construction, firewood for settlements, cleared land for agriculture. Settlers cut down the forests, displacing the game animals Butchella depended on for food. They fenced off land, preventing indigenous access to traditional gathering areas. They viewed Butchella people as obstacles to economic development, rather than as humans with prior rights to their own territory. Conflicts between settlers and Butchella people were inevitable, as traditional lands were appropriated and traditional lifestyles became impossible. When Butchella resisted dispossession, when they took food from settlers who'd displaced their traditional food sources, when they objected to being excluded from their own ancestral lands, settlers responded with violence. And that violence was justified through narratives about indigenous savagery. If these people had mistreated Eliza Fraser, surely they deserved harsh responses when they threatened settlers. Colonial authorities established reserves where Butchella people were required to live, forcing them off their traditional lands into confined areas with inadequate resources. These reserves served multiple purposes. They cleared indigenous people from lands settlers wanted. They concentrated indigenous populations for easier control and surveillance. They forced dependence on government rations that gave colonial authorities leverage over indigenous behavior. Life on reserves was miserable. Overcrowding, inadequate food, disease, and despair. The legal system treated indigenous peoples as less than fully human, with different and inferior rights compared to Europeans. Butchella people couldn't testify in court against white people, meaning they had no legal recourse when settlers committed crimes against them. They couldn't own property under colonial law, couldn't make contracts, couldn't access the legal protections that Europeans took for granted. This legal invisibility meant violence against indigenous peoples went largely unpunished, while any indigenous resistance faced harsh penalties. Forced family separations accelerated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through what became known as the stolen generations policies. Indigenous children, particularly those with partial European ancestry, were removed from families and placed in institutions or adopted by white families. The explicit goal was to breed out aboriginality within a few generations, to destroy indigenous culture by preventing its transmission to children. Tens of thousands of children were stolen, creating trauma that echoed across generations as families were torn apart and cultural continuity was broken. The Butchella language suffered devastating decline as speakers died without passing it to the next generation, as children were forbidden to learn it, as the contexts where it would naturally be spoken were destroyed. Languages carry culture. They embed world views, traditional knowledge, spiritual concepts that can't be fully translated. When languages die, irreplaceable knowledge dies with them. The Butchella language became critically endangered, known by only a few elderly speakers by the late 20th century. A victim of policies partly justified through reference to Eliza Fraser's lies about savage behavior that supposedly demonstrated indigenous people's need for civilizing intervention. Traditional culture practices faced similar devastation. Ceremonies that had been performed for thousands of years were forbidden as pagan practices incompatible with Christianity. Traditional land management through controlled burning was prohibited, leading to massive wildfires that destroyed ecosystems the Butchella had successfully managed for millennia. Knowledge about plant uses, navigation, astronomy, kinship systems, all the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years, was actively suppressed as colonial authorities sought to replace indigenous knowledge with European knowledge. The population consequences were catastrophic. The Butchella population declined by over 90% between 1830 and 1930, falling from several thousand people to a few hundred. This decline resulted from multiple factors: introduced diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza that killed people with no immunity, malnutrition resulting from dispossession, violence from colonial forces and settlers, despair and social breakdown, low birth rates in missions and reserves, families were separated, and traditional social structures destroyed. It was a demographic catastrophe approaching genocidal proportions. By the mid-20th century, the Butchella had been almost completely dispossessed and culturally devastated. Gari had been renamed Fraser Island, erasing the indigenous name that had existed for thousands of years. Most Butchella people lived off their traditional lands, in mainland towns or reserves, unable to access ancestral sites or practice traditional culture. Their language was nearly extinct, their traditional knowledge largely lost, their connection to country severely damaged. They'd gone from being autonomous people living successfully in their territory to being marginalized minority in a colonial society that viewed them with contempt or pity. And throughout this entire process of dispossession and destruction, Eliza Fraser's false testimony provided narrative justification. Every policy that harmed indigenous peoples, every act of violence, Every family separation, every land appropriation, all of it could be justified through reference to indigenous savagery, exemplified by the Fraser story. Her lies had become foundational myth in colonial ideology, repeated endlessly to explain why indigenous peoples needed to be controlled, civilized, or eliminated for everyone's safety and benefit. The particular cruelty of this situation is that the Butchella had actually helped Eliza Fraser, had kept her alive when she would otherwise have died, had fulfilled their cultural obligations to assist vulnerable strangers, and in return for this humanitarian action, they were demonized, dispossessed, and nearly destroyed as a people. The reward for kindness was devastation, with the lies of the person they'd helped being weaponized against them. Few historical injustices are as clear-cut or as bitter as this one. The process of historical reckoning with the Eliza Fraser story began slowly in the mid-20th century, accelerated dramatically in recent decades as Australia confronted its colonial history more honestly. This reckoning has involved academic research exposing the lies, Indigenous activism demanding truth-telling, legal and symbolic efforts toward justice, and cultural shifts in how the story is understood and told. The journey from colonial myth to historical truth has been long and incomplete, but significant progress has occurred. Academic historians began questioning the Fraser narrative seriously in the 1970s and 1980s, examining contradictions in Eliza's testimony, comparing her accounts with other survivors' testimonies, analyzing how her stories changed over time, and considering the political uses to which her narrative had been put. Scholars like K. Schaefer and others published detailed analyses demonstrating that Eliza Fraser was an unreliable narrator whose testimony couldn't be trusted without independent corroboration, and that most of her most dramatic claims were likely fabrications. This academic work faced significant resistance initially. The Fraser story was deeply embedded in Australian national mythology, taught in schools, repeated in popular culture, accepted as historical fact by multiple generations. Challenging it meant challenging comfortable narratives about colonial history, about Indigenous peoples, about Australia's founding. Some people reacted defensively, accusing historians of being politically correct revisionists trying to destroy Australian heritage rather than scholars seeking historical truth. But the evidence was overwhelming once scholars examined it systematically. The contradictions between Eliza's various retellings, the lack of physical evidence for her most extreme claims, the testimony from other survivors contradicting her, the obvious financial incentives for exaggeration, the propaganda uses her stories served. All of this pointed unmistakably toward fabrication. Gradually, academic consensus shifted toward viewing Eliza Fraser as unreliable witness, whose testimony said more about colonial ideology than about actual Indigenous behavior. Indigenous activists and communities had been saying this for over a century, but their voices had been ignored by colonial and post-colonial society. Butchella descendants and other Indigenous Australians knew, from oral histories and from logical analysis, that the Fraser story didn't make sense, that their ancestors wouldn't have behaved as Eliza described, that the whole narrative was propaganda designed to justify dispossession. When academic historians finally confirmed what Indigenous people had always known, it was vindication, but also frustration that it had taken so long for their testimony to be believed. The campaign to restore Ugari's Indigenous name became a focal point for broader efforts at historical justice. The island had been called Fraser Island for over 150 years, a constant reminder of colonial lies and Indigenous dispossession. Butchella activists argued that restoring the name Gari would be an important symbolic step toward acknowledging historical truth. toward honoring Indigenous connection to country, toward undoing some small part of the damage Eliza Fraser's lies had caused. The campaign faced opposition from those invested in the Fraser name, tourism operators who'd built brands around Fraser Island, residents who'd grown up with that name, people who viewed any change as erasing history or caving to political correctness. But Indigenous advocates persisted, arguing that keeping a name based on lies was itself a form of ongoing injustice, that Gari was the original name used for thousands of years before colonial renaming, that restoring it was both historically accurate and morally right. In 2023, after years of advocacy and negotiation, the Queensland government officially restored the name Gari alongside Fraser Island in a dual naming arrangement, with plans to eventually transition fully to Kagari. This was a significant victory, though incomplete. True justice would mean completely removing the Fraser name that honored the perpetrator of damaging lies. But even partial restoration represented progress, acknowledging that Indigenous names and Indigenous history matter, that colonial narratives can be challenged and changed. Educational curricula have been updated to present more accurate accounts of the Fraser story. Where previous generations learned Eliza's fabrications as fact, modern Australian students learn about her as an unreliable narrator, about the contradictions in her testimony, about how her lies were used for propaganda purposes. They learn about the Butchella perspective, about Indigenous oral histories contradicting colonial narratives, about the importance of examining sources critically and not accepting convenient stories without evidence. This educational shift is crucial for preventing future generations from inheriting the prejudices colonial myths created. Students who learn the truth about Eliza Fraser are less likely to accept simplistic narratives about Indigenous savagery, more likely to question colonial justifications for dispossession, better equipped to think critically about how history gets written and whose voices get heard. Education can't undo past harm, but it can prevent similar harms from continuing into the future. Museums and heritage sites on Gari have updated their interpretive materials to reflect current historical understanding. Where previous displays presented Eliza's account uncritically, modern exhibits acknowledge the controversies, present Indigenous perspectives, explain how the story was used politically. Some sites include direct testimony from Butchella descendants, explaining their community's oral histories and their responses to colonial myths about their ancestors. Tourism on Gari has become more respectful of Indigenous heritage and more honest about colonial history. Tour operators increasingly employ Indigenous guides who can share traditional knowledge and Indigenous perspectives on the island's history. Visitors learn about the sophisticated Butchella culture that existed for thousands of years before colonization, about traditional land management practices, about the real history of European contact, rather than the mythologized colonial version. Legal recognition of Indigenous rights has advanced significantly, though incompletely. The Butchella people gained native title recognition for some of their traditional lands, acknowledging their continuous connection to country despite colonial dispossession. This legal recognition doesn't restore all that was lost: the land theft, the cultural destruction, the deaths, the trauma. But it represents acknowledgement that Indigenous peoples have rights that preceded and survive colonial appropriation. Reconciliation efforts between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians have included specific acknowledgements about the Fraser story and its harmful legacy. Official apologies have been issued for the lies and for the policies those lies helped enable. Reconciliation isn't just about saying sorry, but about changing relationships, sharing power, ensuring Indigenous voices are heard and respected, and addressing ongoing inequalities that are legacies of colonial injustice. Cultural reclamation efforts by Butchella people have focused on reviving language, practicing traditional ceremonies, teaching young people cultural knowledge, maintaining connection to country. These efforts face enormous challenges, given how much was destroyed during the colonial era, but there's been remarkable resilience and determination to keep culture alive and to rebuild what was lost. Every ceremony performed, every word of language taught to a new generation, every connection to country maintained is a victory against the cultural genocide that Eliza Fraser's lies helped enable. The broader Australian society has engaged in difficult conversations about colonial history, about Indigenous dispossession, about the lies that justified injustice. These conversations are uncomfortable for many non-Indigenous Australians who'd prefer not to confront the ugliness of colonial history or who feel defensive about critique of their ancestors. But honest history requires facing uncomfortable truths, acknowledging that the society we inherited was built partly on lies and violence, and taking responsibility for addressing ongoing legacies of injustice. The process of historical reckoning remains incomplete. Fraser Island hasn't been completely renamed Gari yet. Many Australians still don't know the truth about Eliza Fraser's fabrications. Indigenous peoples still face discrimination and disadvantage rooted in colonial dispossession. The damage done by colonial lies and violence continues, echoing through generations. But progress has occurred. Truth has gained ground against myth, and Indigenous voices are finally being heard after centuries of suppression. The story of this reckoning is itself important history. It demonstrates that historical narratives can change, that lies can eventually be exposed and corrected, that justice delayed is better than justice denied. It shows that Indigenous peoples have remarkable resilience, maintaining culture and connection to country despite sustained efforts to destroy both. It proves that speaking truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable, that confronting difficult history is necessary for moving forward honestly, that acknowledgement of injustice is the first step toward addressing it. The Eliza Fraser case has become a teaching example about how history gets distorted, how personal lies can have political consequences, how colonial propaganda operates, and how historical correction happens. It's studied in universities, discussed in reconciliation forums, referenced in debates about truth-telling and Indigenous rights. The lies Eliza Fraser told 190 years ago are finally being definitively identified as lies, and the truth about what actually happened is being recovered and told. Truth came very late, but it came. That itself offers hope for other cases where colonial myths persist and where Indigenous voices still struggle to be heard against dominant narratives. The long arc of history can bend toward truth, though the bending requires conscious effort and doesn't happen automatically. Eliza Fraser died in 1858, over 165 years ago. The specific harms her lies enabled happened primarily in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The people she lied about, and most of those who suffered directly from policies her lies justified, have been dead for generations. So why does this old story still matter? What lessons does it offer for our contemporary world? Understanding why historical lies remain relevant requires examining how past injustices shape present realities and how patterns of deception repeat across time and context. The first and most obvious reason the Fraser story matters is that its consequences persist. The Butchella people still live with the aftermath of colonial dispossession that Eliza's lies helped enable. They lost most of their traditional lands, much of their language and cultural knowledge, their autonomous way of life. These losses aren't just historical facts, but ongoing realities that affect current Butchella people's lives, opportunities, identities, and well-being. You can't understand their present circumstances without understanding the historical injustices that created those circumstances. The demographic and cultural devastation inflicted on Indigenous Australians during the colonial era has intergenerational effects that persist today. The trauma of family separations, the loss of language and culture, the experience of discrimination and violence, all of this gets transmitted across generations through various mechanisms. Children raised in trauma become traumatized parents. Lost cultural knowledge can't be easily recovered. Communities disrupted by dispossession struggle to rebuild social cohesion. The past isn't past when its effects continue shaping the present. Indigenous Australians today face significantly worse outcomes than non-Indigenous Australians on virtually every measure of well-being: health, education, income, employment, incarceration rates, life expectancy. These disparities aren't natural or inevitable, but are legacies of colonial injustice. Understanding that history, including specific cases like Eliza Fraser's, lies enabling dispossession, is crucial for understanding why these inequalities exist and what would be required to address them. You can't fix problems you don't understand the causes of. The Fraser story also matters because the patterns it exemplifies continue in contemporary contexts. People still lie for personal gain, and their lies still get amplified and weaponized for political purposes. Myths about dangerous minorities threatening vulnerable majorities still circulate. Stories designed to justify injustice still get repeated as fact. The specific details change, but the underlying patterns remain remarkably consistent across time and place. Consider how the Fraser narrative worked. A member of a dominant group claimed victimization by a marginalized group, told a dramatic story that confirmed existing prejudices, received attention and material rewards for her testimony, saw her lies amplified by institutions that found them politically useful, and thereby contributed to policies that harmed the people she'd lied about. This exact pattern recurs throughout history and continues in various forms today. We see it when false accusations get weaponized against racial minorities, when fabricated stories about immigrants or refugees circulate to justify harsh policies, when lies about marginalized groups are repeated by politicians and media outlets because they serve useful political purposes. The Fraser case is historical, but the pattern it exemplifies is contemporary. Understanding the historical case helps us recognize and resist contemporary manifestations of the same pattern. The story also teaches crucial lessons about propaganda and how it operates. Eliza's lies were effective propaganda because they pushed emotional buttons: fear for white women's safety, racial prejudice about savage minorities, moral outrage at supposed cruelty, satisfaction at having reasons to feel superior to others. Effective propaganda rarely relies on pure fabrication, but rather on exaggeration, selective emphasis, playing to existing prejudices, and strategic omission of contradictory evidence. All of these propaganda techniques remain common today. Political movements and media organizations still use emotional manipulation rather than factual argument. They still exaggerate threats from target groups while downplaying complexities. They still select evidence that confirms their narrative while ignoring evidence that contradicts it. Learning to recognize these techniques by studying historical cases like Fraser helps us identify and resist contemporary propaganda more effectively. The case demonstrates how institutional power amplifies certain voices while suppressing others. Eliza Fraser's testimony dominated public consciousness, despite being contradicted by other survivors and by Indigenous people themselves, because she was the voice that institutions wanted to amplify. Her lies served colonial purposes, so colonial institutions, newspapers, government, churches, schools, repeated them uncritically, while ignoring or suppressing contradictory testimony. This pattern of whose voices get amplified versus whose get suppressed remains relevant today. Marginalized groups' testimony about their own experiences often gets dismissed or ignored, while less credible testimony from powerful groups gets accepted uncritically. Understanding this historical pattern helps us question whose voices dominate contemporary discourse, why certain narratives circulate widely while others remain obscure, and what power structures shape our access to information. The story teaches about the importance of critical thinking and source evaluation. Eliza Fraser was accepted as truthful witness despite obvious red flags. Her story changed with each telling, other witnesses contradicted her, she had clear financial incentives to exaggerate, her claims lacked physical evidence. People believed her anyway because they wanted to believe her, because her story confirmed their prejudices, because questioning it seemed disrespectful to a woman who'd genuinely suffered hardship, even if she was lying about the details. These same dynamics affect how people evaluate information today. We tend to accept claims that confirm our existing beliefs while scrutinizing claims that challenge them. We give more credibility to people we identify with than to people we view as outsiders. We confuse genuine suffering in one domain with truthfulness in all domains. Learning to recognize these cognitive biases by studying historical cases helps us evaluate contemporary claims more rigorously. The case also demonstrates the importance of truth-telling and historical honesty, even when truth is uncomfortable. For over a century, Australian society preferred the comfortable lie that Eliza Fraser was a reliable witness to Indigenous savagery because that myth justified colonial project and allowed people to feel good about their history. Confronting the truth required admitting that colonial expansion was based partly on lies, that injustices were committed against people who'd actually been helpful and humanitarian, that an entire people were demonized for propaganda purposes. This discomfort is why historical truth-telling faces resistance. It's psychologically easier to believe comfortable myths than uncomfortable truths, especially when the truths implicate us or our ancestors in injustice. But maintaining lies causes ongoing harm, prevents healing and reconciliation, and distorts our understanding of how we got to our current situation. Truth is necessary, even when it's painful, and the Fraser case demonstrates why confronting historical lies matters for moving forward more justly. The story illustrates how individuals' choices can have consequences far beyond what they intended or imagined. Eliza Fraser probably never intended her lies to enable cultural genocide or contribute to Indigenous dispossession. She was motivated by personal financial need and desire for attention, not by conscious desire to harm Indigenous peoples on a massive scale. But her personal lies were amplified by systems that used them for purposes far beyond her original intent, creating harm that echoed across generations. This teaches important lessons about moral responsibility in complex systems. We don't control how our words and actions will be used by others, but we bear some responsibility for foreseeable consequences. Eliza could have predicted that portraying Indigenous people as cruel savages would worsen their treatment by colonizers. She chose personal benefit over concern for these foreseeable harms. Her case reminds us that we're accountable not just for our intentions, but for reasonably predictable consequences of our choices. The eventual exposure of her lies demonstrates that truth can eventually prevail, even when delayed by generations. For over a century, Eliza's fabrications were accepted as fact. Indigenous people knew they were lies and said so, but weren't believed. Other survivors provided contradictory testimony that was ignored. But eventually, through persistent Indigenous advocacy and honest historical research, the truth came out. The lies were exposed, the real story was recovered, and historical understanding was corrected. This offers hope for other cases where injustice is based on lies. and where truth struggles to be heard. Truth-telling is often a long struggle against power and prejudice, but the struggle isn't futile. Evidence matters, even when it's initially ignored. Consistent advocacy for truth eventually breaks through, even when it takes generations. The arc of history can bend toward truth, though the bending requires sustained effort and doesn't happen automatically. Finally, the story teaches about the possibility and importance of historical justice, however imperfect and delayed. The restoration of the name Khagari doesn't undo colonial dispossession, doesn't restore what was destroyed, doesn't bring back the dead. But it matters symbolically and practically as acknowledgement of truth, as honoring of Indigenous peoples, as rejection of the lies that justified injustice. Small acts of historical correction and symbolic justice are meaningful, even when they can't fully remedy past harms. Eliza Fraser's lies killed people, destroyed cultures, enabled dispossession, and caused intergenerational trauma. But the truth eventually emerged. The lies were exposed, and steps toward justice have begun. The story is both tragedy and testimony to human resilience, both warning about how lies can devastate and hope that truth can prevail. It matters because its patterns continue, because its consequences persist, because understanding how injustice was justified helps us resist current injustices, and because truth-telling is necessary work even when it comes late. Dead lies still matter because their effects live on, because similar lies continue being told, and because exposing them is necessary for moving toward more just futures. That's why we still tell this story, why we must keep telling it accurately, why Eliza Fraser's name should be remembered not with honor, but with caution about what damage liars can do.